The city of Abuja was alive with movement. Cars honked impatiently in traffic, traders called out to customers in the bustling Woos market, and the aroma of roasted corn and suya filled the air. Amidst this chaos lived Chinedu Okafor, a 10-year-old boy whose world was far quieter than the city that surrounded him. Chinedu was a bright child, full of curiosity and energy. He loved playing football with his classmates, racing across the school field with laughter trailing behind him. But as soon as the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day, his excitement faded. He dreaded returning home, not because it was unsafe, but because it was empty. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okafor, were hard-working traders. His father owned a thriving shop in Wuza Market where he sold electronics, while his mother ran a textile business in Garki, supplying customers with the finest Ankara fabrics. Their work kept them busy from sunrise to well past sunset. Each afternoon, Chinedu's school bus would drop him off at the front gate of their compound in Gwarimpa. He would unlock the door, step inside, and be greeted by silence. No one asked how his day went, no one prepared his lunch, and no one told him stories. He would wander through the house, trying to entertain himself with television or his school books. But loneliness always found a way to creep in. One evening, as his mother bustled in the kitchen preparing dinner, Chinedu stood by the counter, fidgeting with his fingers. "Mommy, I'm always alone. I don't like it," he said softly. Mrs. Okafor paused, looking at her son. She sighed. "Nedu, it's only for a few hours, my dear. Daddy and I are working hard so you can have a good life." "But I don't want to be alone," he insisted. His mother wiped her hands on a towel and knelt beside him. "I understand, my love," she said, stroking his cheek. "Maybe we can find a solution." That night, as she lay beside her husband in bed, she brought up Chinedu's complaint. "He's always alone when we're at work," she said. "I think we should find someone to watch him." Mr. Okafor rubbed his chin. "Do you have someone in mind?" She nodded. "What about Auntie Eket? She's our neighbor and she's always friendly with him." Auntie Eket was a young woman in her late 20s who lived alone in the flat next to theirs. She was well known in the neighborhood, cheerful, charming, and always ready with a smile. She often gave Chinedu biscuits and chin-chin when she saw him playing outside. The next morning, Mrs. Okafor pulled Chinedu aside. "Nedu, how would you feel about staying with Auntie Eket after school until I come home?" Chinedu hesitated but then nodded. He had always liked her. And so, the arrangement was made. The first afternoon he spent at Auntie Ekayet's flat was better than he had expected. She welcomed him warmly, set a plate of steaming jollof rice before him, and handed him a cold bottle of malt. "How was school today, my dear?" she asked, her voice sweet. At first, Chinedu was shy, but she had a way of making him feel comfortable. She bought him storybooks, let him watch cartoons, and even gave him a video game console. "You are like the little brother I never had," she told him with a smile. Chinedu smiled back, feeling cared for in a way he hadn't before. What he didn't know was that this kindness came with a price. The first few days at Auntie Eket's house were wonderful. Every afternoon when Chinedu knocked on her door, she welcomed him with a bright smile, ushering him in like a mother would her own child. She always had a hot plate of food waiting for him, sometimes jollof rice with chicken, other times fried plantains with eggs. "How was school today, my dear?" she asked daily, her voice as sweet as honey. Chinedu quickly became comfortable in her home. Her small but neat flat smelled of lavender, and she had a soft couch that was much more comfortable than the stiff wooden chairs in his own home. She even let him watch cartoons for as long as he wanted, something his mother would never allow. But the best part, she bought him a Game Boy. "Nedu, this is for you," she said one afternoon, placing the gaming device in his small hands. "I bought it just for you because you are special to me." Chinedu's eyes widened. No one had ever bought him a gift like this before. "Thank you, Auntie," he beamed, hugging the console to his chest. She chuckled and patted his head. "Anything for my little brother." For a while, Chinedu thought he had found a second home. Then everything changed. One Tuesday afternoon, after he had eaten and was settled on the couch, Auntie Ekaet sat beside him, closer than usual. "Nedu," she said, lowering her voice, "I want to teach you a special game." He turned to her, curious. "What kind of game?" "It's a secret game. Only you and I can play it," she whispered. "Nobody else must know." Chinedu frowned. "Why?" "Because it's only for special people. You trust me, don't you?" He nodded slowly. Auntie Ekaet had been nothing but kind to him, so why should he doubt her? But when the game began, his stomach twisted in knots. She guided his hands in ways he didn't understand, made him touch places that felt wrong. Her expressions were different, her eyes half closed, her breathing uneven. Chinedu pulled his hands away. "Auntie, I don't like this game," he said, shifting uncomfortably. She chuckled softly. "Don't worry, my dear. You'll get used to it. In fact, you'll like it soon." But he didn't. The next day the game continued, and the next, and the next. Each time Chinedu felt trapped. He wanted to run away, but where would he go? He wanted to tell someone, but who would believe him? His parents were always busy. They barely had time to listen when he told them about school. Would they listen to this? And so he kept quiet. Soon he began dreading his visits to Auntie Ekaet's house. At school he delayed going home. He took longer packing his books, pretending to search for lost pencils. On Fridays, when school closed earlier, he walked as slowly as possible, hoping time would magically stretch so he wouldn't have to go. But no matter what he did, 3 p.m. always came. The school bus always dropped him off at home, and he always ended up at her door. The game never stopped. Chinedu's nightmares started soon after. Each night he woke up covered in sweat, his heart pounding. The shadows in his room seemed to move, shifting into shapes that reminded him of Auntie Ekaet's hands. Then came the bedwetting. The first time it happened, he thought it was a mistake. He had stopped bedwetting when he was 5. But when he woke up the next morning and found his sheets damp again, fear gripped him. Was this because of the game? Shame burned in his chest. He couldn't tell his parents. His mother was a strict woman. If she found out, she might beat him, thinking he was being careless. So he hid it. Each morning he woke up early, stripped the sheets, and tried to dry them before anyone noticed. But the bedwetting didn't stop. It continued every night, and the more it happened, the more anxious he became. At school, he could barely focus. The once lively, playful boy became withdrawn. During break time, when his friends played football, Chinedu sat alone under a tree, staring at nothing. He didn't laugh anymore. He didn't smile. His teacher, Mrs. Anani, noticed. One afternoon, after the other students had left the classroom, she called him to her desk. "Chinedu, is something wrong?" she asked gently. He shook his head quickly. "No, Ma." She studied him. She had been a teacher for years and had seen this pattern before. Children didn't suddenly stop playing. They didn't suddenly stop smiling unless something was wrong. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she said. Chinedu hesitated, his fingers twitching. He wanted to tell her. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The fear was too strong. What if Auntie Ekaet found out? What if his parents didn't believe him? So he did what he had been doing for weeks. He swallowed his pain. "Yes, Ma, everything is fine," he lied. Mrs. Anena wasn't convinced. The following day, Chinedu couldn't take it anymore. After class, instead of running outside with his classmates, he walked up to Mrs. Anena's desk, his head bowed. "Auntie, I have something to tell you," he whispered. She leaned in closer, giving him her full attention. Chinedu looked left and right, making sure no one was close enough to hear. Then, in the quietest voice, he spoke the words he had been too afraid to say. "Auntie Ekaet, she does things to me. She makes me do things I don't understand." Mrs. Anani's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected something was wrong, but she hadn't imagined this. She placed a comforting hand on Chinedu's shoulder. "Nedu, you are very brave for telling me this," she said gently. "I promise you, you are not alone. We will help you." That evening, the school called his parents for an urgent meeting. When Mr. and Mrs. Okafor arrived, the headmistress wasted no time. "Your son has been suffering in silence," she said. "Auntie Eket has been harming him." Mr. Okafor clenched his fists. His wife gasped, covering her mouth in shock. For the first time, they realized their mistake, not in providing for their son, but in not listening to him. That night, there was a knock on Auntie Eket's door. When she opened it, 3 police officers stood before her. "Miss Eket, you are under arrest for child molestation." Her face turned pale. "You must be mistaken," she stammered, but the officers didn't listen. In moments, she was handcuffed and led away. From that day, Chinedu's parents changed. His mother picked him up from school every day. His father took more time to be with him. At school, Mrs. Anane checked on him regularly, reminding him that his voice mattered. Though the nightmares didn't fade immediately, his therapist assured him he would heal in time. And as he slowly reclaimed his childhood, Chinedu realized one thing. He had been heard, and that was the beginning of his healing.